In the frozen sky above northern Germany, the wind carried a sound that pilots never forgot. The thin, high-pitched scream that slipped through shattered glass and twisted metal when a bomber was dying. On December 20th, 1943, alone, B-17 drifted through that cold silence, its nose blown open, its engines coughing, its young pilot fighting the controls with numb, frostbitten hands. They were 27,000 feet above a hostile world, and every breath Charles Brown took felt like it might be his last. What he could not know in that moment was that another aircraft was closing in on him, a Messerschmitt flown by a German ace who had already claimed 2 victories that morning. Doctrine said this meeting should end quickly. Training said mercy had no place here. And every rule of total war insisted that enemies must not recognize each other's humanity. Yet something happened in that frozen sky that military planners never imagined and governments later tried to bury. A decision was made, quiet, personal, and profoundly dangerous, that would remain a classified secret for nearly half a century. Because on that day above the smoke and snow of wartime Germany, one man chose honor over war itself. They had taken off before dawn from RAF Kimbolton, climbing into a sky that promised ice flak and fighters long before they reached their target. The men of the 8th Air Force knew what Bremen meant. A city ringed with 250 anti-aircraft guns, a factory complex that fed the Luftwaffe's deadliest fighters, and an air defense network that rarely missed. For a young pilot on his first mission, it was an introduction to war that felt more like a sentence than an assignment. Charlie Brown was 21 years old. Too young, some would say, to command a flying fortress worth $250,000 and filled with 9 other lives. But training had been relentless, and responsibility came early in a war where experience was paid for in blood. His crew, barely older than he was, had learned to trust him. They had painted a name under the nose, Ye Olde Pub. The joke felt lighter on the ground than it would in the air. The mission briefing left little to interpretation. They would fly in a formation of nearly 500 bombers toward the Focke-Wulf plant. Losses were expected. "Some of you won't be coming back," the officer said, and the room went still. Veteran crews called the outer left position in the box formation Purple Heart Corner. The new men didn't have a name for it yet, but they understood what it meant. Exposed, vulnerable, first to be hit, last to be protected. As they crossed the North Sea, the cold hardened into something that felt alive. Ice crept across the wings, frost crawled across oxygen masks. Every 1,000 feet of altitude stripped away another layer of warmth until even breath felt sharp enough to wound. Then the flat came. Black bursts erupted around them, each explosion a sudden blossom of fire and steel. On the bomb run, that long unbroken path where aircraft could not weave or evade Ye Olde Pub was struck head on. The nose shattered. Engine number 2 died instantly. Engine 4 began to overspeed. The cockpit filled with shards of plexiglass and the metallic smell of ruptured hydraulics. When they fell out of formation, it was like watching the world pull away. Contrails faded. The protective wall of guns and aircraft dissolved into empty air. A flying fortress alone was not a fortress at all. It was prey. The fighters arrived the moments later. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove from above, climbing from below, strafing from every angle. Brown did the only thing a bomber pilot could do. He turned into the attack, trying to use the remaining forward guns to disrupt the firing runs. It bought seconds, nothing more. Control cables frayed. The oxygen system ruptured. 2 men passed out. 1 gunner died instantly when a 20-millimeter shell tore through the tail. The aircraft spiraled downwards thousands of feet in seconds until Brown regained consciousness and wrestled the bomber level just above the rooftops of a German town. Inside the shattered fuselage, surrounded by smoke, blood, and freezing air, the crew refused to bail out. They would go home together or they would not go home at all. Above them, somewhere in the clear winter sky, another aircraft banked toward their position. A German ace returning from combat, unaware that he was about to meet the most battered bomber he would ever see, and make a choice no one expected. Franz Stigler had been on the ground for only minutes watching ground crews refuel his Messerschmitt when he heard the stuttering rumble of engines overhead, the sound of an American bomber fighting to stay airborne. He knew the signature instantly. He had spent years reading sounds in the desert skies of North Africa, where a moment of hesitation could mean death. Now back in Germany, that instinct had not left him. He climbed into his aircraft, ignoring the 50 caliber rounds still lodged in his radiator, and took off. One more bomber would push him closer to the Knight's Cross, the medal every fighter pilot dreamed of. He had already downed 2 B-17s that morning. A third would be easy work. But when he caught up to Ye Olde Pub, the fight evaporated. At first glance, the bomber seemed impossible, a machine flying in defiance of physics. The tail section was shredded. The nose was gone. Panels flapped in the slipstream, and through the holes torn by cannon shells, Stigler could see straight into the fuselage. He saw blood on jackets, men slumped over guns, crew members dragging wounded comrades across the floor. He saw unmistakably the body of the tail gunner collapsed against his guns, motionless. This wasn't a combat aircraft anymore. It was a coffin being held in the air by willpower and one remaining engine. Stigler rolled his fighter closer, close enough to see the pilot's face through the shattered cockpit glass. A boy younger than he expected, gripping the controls with the desperation of someone trying to hold his world together by hand. Stigler's finger hovered over the trigger. One squeeze would give him an easy victory, the kind pilots prayed for after hours of deadly dogfights. One squeeze would bring him closer to the highest honor his country could bestow. But Gustav Rodel's words rose like a command from another lifetime. If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. These men were not in parachutes, but they were no longer combatants. They couldn't fight, they couldn't maneuver, they could barely breathe. Shooting them would not be war. It would be murder. Stigler eased his grip on the trigger. He moved up alongside the B-17 so close that the wingtips seemed separated by nothing but winter air. Brown and his co-pilot stared back in disbelief, certain the German was about to finish what the fighters had started. Instead, Stigler raised one gloved hand and pointed down the universal signal to land and surrender. Brown shook his head. He would not put his crew into enemy hands. Stigler tried again, pointing east toward neutral Sweden. A shorter distance, a chance at survival, medical treatment, internment instead of death. But Brown kept the nose pointed toward England even as smoke trailed behind them, even as the bomber drifted lower. In that moment, Stigler understood. These men would not surrender. And if they continued on their current heading, they would meet a wall of anti-aircraft guns waiting along the German coast. He knew with sudden clarity that if he wanted them to live, he would have to do far more than spare them. He would have to protect them. The German coastline stretched ahead like a death sentence. Along the Atlantic Wall, thousands of anti-aircraft guns waited with overlapping fields of fire, designed specifically to destroy aircraft flying low and slow, exactly the condition Ye Olde Pub was trapped in. Brown knew it. Stigler knew it even more. A damaged bomber like this would not survive 30 seconds once the gunners saw it. So Stigler made a decision that defied every regulation, every expectation, every instinct form in the crucible of aerial combat. He eased his Messerschmitt into tight formation, sliding from the bomber's right wing to its left, until his canopy was so close that Brown could see the frost lining the Germans' goggles. They were enemies separated by only a few feet of broken winter air. For a moment, neither pilot moved. They simply held each other's gaze, two young men pushed to the edge of exhaustion, both trying to carry the lives entrusted to them. Then Stigler raised his hand in a formal salute, a gesture nearly lost to the wind, tearing through the bomber's open nose. Not mockery, not triumph, respect. And then he did the unthinkable. He stayed there. To the gunners below, the sight made no sense, a German fighter escorting a wrecked American bomber, wingtip to wingtip flying as one. Doctrine screamed to fire at the intruder, but training the reflex to identify friend from foe froze their hands. The silhouette of a Messerschmitt meant hold fire, and so the guns remained still. Stigler used his own aircraft as a shield, risking a barrage from his own country's defenses if even one gunner recognized the B-17 for what it was. For 15 agonizing minutes, he held formation, matching the bomber's degrading performance with perfect control, compensating for turbulence and the B-17's wounded drift. Any miscalculation would kill them all. Only when the sea opened beneath them, gray, cold, endless, did Stigler finally pull away. He looked across the narrow space one last time. Brown saw the German raise his hand in a final salute before rolling his fighter away and disappearing into the clouds over Germany. For the bomber crew, there was no time to process what had just happened. They still had 250 miles of North Sea between them and home. The aircraft was losing altitude inch by inch. The crew threw out ammunition, guns, equipment, anything that might buy them another mile. Frostbite gnawed at fingers. Engines coughed and rattled in protest. The bomber's skin trembled as if ready to peel away in the wind. Hours crawled by. Brown fought the controls with a wounded shoulder and numbing hands, keeping the wings level through a fog of exhaustion and pain. No radio, no reliable navigation, only instinct and hope. When the English coastline finally appeared, it felt unreal. A thin line of salvation emerging from storm clouds. Brown aimed for the first airfield he saw. With no hydraulics, no flaps, and barely any brakes, the landing was more of a controlled crash than a descent. The B-17 slammed into the runway, bounced, slid off the end, and finally shuddered to a stop in the grass. Silence followed, heavy, overwhelming, sacred. They were alive, Against all logic, against every probability the war had taught them to expect, they had come home. In the debriefing room at RAF Seething, the air felt colder than it had inside the shattered bomber. Intelligence officers listened as Charlie Brown explained the impossible. A German ace had not only spared them, but shielded them from his own defenses. The silence that followed was not awe, it was calculation. Then the verdict came: the incident would be classified permanently. The logic was brutal but predictable. The 8th Air Force was in the middle of a strategic bombing campaign that demanded unwavering aggression. Crews had to believe the enemy was ruthless, mechanical, unrelenting. They had to climb into their aircraft with the certainty that mercy was a luxury no one could afford. A story like this, a German fighter pilot choosing humanity over orders, threatened that mindset. It blurred the sharp edges that total war required. So Brown was told to forget what he had seen, to fly again, to fight again, to never speak the German pilot's name, even if he had known it. Across the ruined cities of Germany, Franz Stigler bore a silence far more dangerous. What he had done sparing an enemy crew, protecting them from German guns, was treason under Nazi law. Pilots had been executed for far less. A single accusation could have ended his life and endangered his family. Stigler locked the memory away, speaking of it to no one. His Knight's Cross no longer mattered. Survival did. For decades, the world knew nothing of the moment when two enemies met in mercy instead of violence. But as archives opened in the late 20th century, militaries and historians found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. The incident challenged the very architecture of wartime ideology. In military academies, the story became a case study in battlefield ethics. The question of whether honor could exist in an age defined by industrial destruction. Museums used it to teach that even in moments of total war, individual agency had not vanished. And veterans who understood better than anyone the impossible choices war demanded carried the story as a quiet reminder that enemies were still human beings. When the tale finally became public, the reaction across the United States, Germany, and beyond was not disbelief but reflection. The war had produced countless tragedies. This instead was something rare, a moment when conscience rose through the smoke and noise and proved stronger than doctrine. And the world understood why it had been hidden for so long. For 47 years, the story lived only in a memory, carried quietly by two men on opposite sides of an ocean, each wondering if the other had survived. When Charlie Brown finally broke his silence in 1986, he was no longer telling a war story. He was searching for a face he had seen through cracked glass and winter air, a face that had stayed with him longer than any explosion or dogfight. The letter from Vancouver changed everything. When Brown and Franz Stigler stood face to face in 1990, the past collapsed into a single moment of recognition. Two men who had once met as enemies now embraced as brothers, not out of sentimentality, but out of a shared understanding of what that December day had demanded of them. They had each carried the weight of it for a lifetime. Now, finally, they carried it together. Their friendship lasted nearly 2 decades. They traveled, spoke, and told their story to veterans who understood its gravity, and to younger generations who struggled to imagine a war where mercy could survive at all. When Stigler gave Brown a book, he wrote inside, "In 1940, I lost my brother. On December 20, 1943, I found another." It was not a metaphor. It was the truth he had lived with. Both men died in 2008, months apart, as if neither could remain long without the other. They were buried thousands of miles from where their lives first intersected. But the bond forged in the freezing sky over Germany endured a quiet defiance of the war that once tried to destroy them. Today, their encounter is taught not as a tale of luck, but as a lesson in responsibility. The idea that even in the harshest moments of human conflict, a single decision can alter the course of countless lives. More than 300 descendants of the Ye Olde Pub crew exist because Stigler chose conscience over orders. And the restored B-17 that now carries the aircraft's colors keeps their story alive in the roar of engines at air shows across America. The battlefield often reveals the worst of humanity, but sometimes in rare moments it reveals the best. And that moment above Germany reminds us that morality isn't erased by war, it is tested by it. If you were in Stigler's position, facing duty on one side and humanity on the other, what choice would you have made? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe stories like this still matter, consider joining us as we continue exploring the lessons history refuses to let us forget.